Ever feel like the resources and advice out there for women are missing something essential? I thought so too, which is why more than 6 years ago, I created She Said, She Said. I'm Laura Cox Kaplan, and after 3 decades in communications and then advocacy and now juggling motherhood and entrepreneurship, trust me, friend, I get it. Making a real impact takes more than just passion. It takes the right mindset, the right skills, the right investments, and the right community. On this show, we dive deep with incredible women from all walks of life who have been there. We uncover the secrets to building influence, navigating tricky relationships, and staying true to ourselves even when it's tough. And let's face it, it often is. I also throw in my own favorite productivity and life hacks, things that have shifted my perspective and might help you too. Wherever you are in your journey, my goal here is to leave you inspired to define success your way and to help you build the confidence you need to tackle your biggest goals. Subscribe today and let's unlock your full potential, your confidence, and your greatest influence. Hey friend, welcome to episode 332 of She Said, She Said podcast. This is the show that helps you build and sustain meaningful influence in your life and career. I'm your host, Laura Cox Kaplan, and today we're diving into what I think is kind of a surprising and powerful masterclass in strategy, but it's delivered through the lens of one of the most influential women on the planet. My guest today is Kevin Evers. He is senior editor at the Harvard Business Review, and he's the author of a terrific new book called There's Nothing Like This: The Strategic Genius of Taylor Swift. Now, in the book and in our conversation, we unpack how Taylor Swift went from a teenage girl singing in a Tennessee shopping mall to become the global powerhouse that she is today. We talk about how she turned a devastating loss of her master recordings into a creative and financial triumph that ultimately rewrote the rules of the music industry. And friend, while I'm a fan, this episode is not a tribute episode. It is actually an exploration into the strategic instincts and the bold decisions that Taylor Swift herself made that actually transformed her from artist to empire. And we're going to unpack what makes her approach so effective and then how we can apply those same principles to our own lives, careers, brands, and businesses. Beneath all that glitter, Swift's playbook is a blueprint for any ambitious professional that we can ultimately adapt. Together, Kevin and I will explore 4 key areas: strategic storytelling, authenticity as strategy, adaptation and reinvention, building and leveraging community, and handling setbacks and criticisms. So friend, whether you're building a business, leading a team, or ultimately rethinking your next chapter, this conversation, episode 332, is packed with so many fascinating takeaways. I think you're going to find a lot of inspiration, a lot of clarity, a lot of confidence, and hopefully even more influence. So let's dive in. Here is episode 332 with my guest, Kevin Evers. Enjoy. Kevin, welcome to She Said, She Said.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm looking forward to this.
Well, I'm really happy to have you. I was so intrigued when I ran across the book and then had a chance to read it. It is so interesting and so insightful. And I think it resonated with me personally, both because I live with 2 Swifties. I'm maybe a later adapter as a Swiftie, as the case were,
Okay.
but I just am sort of blown away by the way in which Taylor Swift has built her brand, how she's evolved, all the things that you talk about in the book. Before we get into that, though, I would love for you to spend just a minute telling people who you are and what you do.
So I am Kevin. I am a senior editor at HBR. I've worked for HBR for over a decade now. I'm aging myself, but it's been a great ride these 10 years. And so I work on the book side of HBR, so I acquire and edit books on all sorts of topics. I always like to say it seems like I edit everything but novels and cookbooks these days. And I decided to take all of those skills that I've learned, all the knowledge that I've learned working with some great business minds, and apply that to the career of Taylor Swift. So here we are.
Okay. What was the inspiration? What was that moment where you were like, okay, this is a book?
The funny thing is, I didn't set out to write a book at all, and I definitely didn't set out to write a book about Taylor
Uh,
Swift. So part of my job is to occasionally come up with book ideas and then find someone who can write those books for me. And that was the case with this one. I wanted someone to write a book about an industry that has been disrupted over the last 20 years. And I sat with that for a couple days and realized, okay, well, what industry could I pick? And then I thought the music industry since Napster in the late 90s, early 2000s has gone through massive changes and disruptions over the last 20 years. And then a few days later, I said, well, let's make that more human. Can we follow an artist over the
right.
course of those 20 years? And there aren't many artists that were on the list. You could say Beyonce and you could say Taylor Swift. Those are really the only two who've been able to still grow their popularity. And I looked for a few other people who could write the book for me, but I had such a clear sense of what the book needed to be, and it felt like malpractice to hand it off to someone
Mm.
else. But the more I looked into Taylor's career, the more and more impressed I was, and the more and more surprised I was. And I also knew that it would make for a great book too, because I wanted to write a book in chronological order. I wanted to tell the story in chronological order. And Taylor's career is so full of ups and downs and challenges and opportunities. And she's made bold decisions throughout her career. And I knew I could dramatize that way in a very interesting and hopefully fascinating way.
It's so interesting how this idea ultimately came together. You were not necessarily a Swiftie or wouldn't necessarily describe yourself as a Swiftie. I don't know if you are now or not, but you weren't looking at this necessarily as a fan, right?
No. And there weren't other books that really tackled her from a neutral and authoritative standpoint. There's a lot of books out there
Yeah.
that are written by fans for fans. I didn't want to do that. I thought her career deserved a a different approach. And I was not a hardcore fan when I started. I was a casual fan, I'd say. My daughter is a huge Swiftie. She's 8 years old now, loves Taylor Swift. And but at the end of the process, it's after researching and writing this book for 2 plus years, I would definitely consider myself a huge fan of her music, but also her approach to her career.
So you talk in the book about this idea of a founder's mindset, which seems like a really interesting way of thinking about a musical artist. Talk about what you mean by that when you describe that she has a founder's mindset.
When I say she has a founder's mentality, I mean she has a very clear vision for what she wants to do. She is very customer obsessed, in her case, fan obsessed. And then she is relentless about following the steps to realize her vision. And you can see this all throughout her career. And you can see this very early on in her career. When she was 13, 14 years old, this is how the book starts. She had a very clear vision for what she wanted to do. She wanted to write her own songs, and she wanted to write those songs for an audience of her peers, teenage girls. Now, that sounds simple, but country music was much different back then than it is today. It was very male dominated, and the industry, after past failures, thought there's no market for teenage girls in country music. And there's no way that country radio would get behind a teenage artist who was singing songs for teenage girls. And they were right. They had the data and they had the past failures to prove that. But Taylor and her team thought differently and they persisted. And because they persisted, Taylor ended up breaking into a market that other people had long ignored, which to me is the classic entrepreneurial story. But if she didn't have that founder's mentality, I'm not so sure that we'd be talking about Taylor Swift today.
I misspoke and I called it founder's mindset because we talk about mindset all the time, but mentality, really the approach that she's taking to building her brand and her career. Another element of that, and one of the core areas that I want to talk about in this conversation with you, is her skill as a storyteller and why that ultimately matters so much and how she is able to connect with her fans. Talk a little bit about her abilities as a storyteller and how we can parlay that skill in our own careers and lives.
Taylor is a great songwriter, right? So that she's a great storyteller when it comes to singing her songs too, but she understands that she needs to do more than that to catch her fans' attention. So she's very good at doing the thing that not many rock stars or pop stars do because they think it's uncool.
Mhm.
She really builds stories and lore around her own albums, right? When we think of Picasso, Picasso didn't say, "Hey, I'm in my blue period right now," right? And he left that up to scholars to decide and art enthusiasts to decide that he was in his blue period. Taylor doesn't do that. She doesn't leave that stuff up to chance. She names her albums very specific things, and then she builds worlds around those albums. And then she doesn't leave the interpretation in many instances up to her fans. Now, you can interpret her songs in many different ways. That's why as a songwriter, she's so good. But she will preface many of her albums with a note describing why she wrote the album and the emotions that went into the album and the aesthetic of the album. So she's really good at world building
Mhm.
around her albums. She participates in the myth of Taylor Swift. She participates in the lore. She doesn't leave that stuff up to chance. And I mean, one thing I think we can really learn from this is she advocates for herself, right?
Mhm.
She doesn't shy away from her success, and she doesn't shy away from telling people about why things are so important to her.
Mhm.
She doesn't leave that stuff up to chance. And one of my favorite examples of this is when she released her first full pop album, 1989. Huge transition for her, huge transformation, because she had built her brand on this DIY aesthetic, that she was writing her own songs, that she was authentic, and that she was a country star. Moving to pop, you would she had to worry that some of her fans would not like that transition because it was a big
Right.
change. So what does Taylor do? She hosts a live stream that was simulcast on ABC, and she sits down without a co-host, and she acts like an overcaffeinated morning TV show host, and she's sitting down. There's high production value. She's sitting down on a couch among her fans, and she describes to her fans why she made this change. And she uses the language of personal transformation and growth to explain why she made such a radical change. And of course, that made a big impact because her fans came along for the ride, even though she did make this big transformation. And that's something that sets Taylor apart. She doesn't communicate like a rock
Right.
star. She communicates more like a Steve Jobs up there pitching his products. And that's what Taylor does too.
Yeah, it's so fascinating that the combination of incredible storytelling genius, but also just a deep understanding of how to communicate and connect with the people that are following you in order to bring them along with you. And I find that connection so incredibly fascinating, really interesting. Um, so, related to all of that is this idea of authenticity. And we talk about authenticity as it relates to our personal brands and how important that is. But there's a balance,
Uh-huh.
right, that has to be struck when we're sharing a vulnerability, when we're sharing personal details. It's not clear to me that she holds back very much. Like, you have a sense that you really know her. Now, I don't know whether that's actually true. I don't actually know her, obviously, but um, maybe talk about how she strikes that balance and maybe advice that you have for others who are kind of watching what she's done and thinking about this idea of authenticity and vulnerability and sort of what's the appropriate balance.
She strikes a balance. A lot of the vulnerability and the intimacy comes through in her songs. It's not in her interaction on social media so much. And I think a big reason why her fans feel so connected to her and feel like they know her so well is because her songs are hyper specific, they're hyper personal, yet there's still enough ambiguity there to leave things up to interpretation, right? And so in some ways that helps fan engagement because she's giving them a lot of information, but not so much information that they aren't curious. So that makes her a great songwriter. In terms of her interaction with fans, I think she has built her brand on authenticity, especially very early on in her career. And she was more extremely online than she is now. She used to be on YouTube all the time, giving se- behind the scenes footage of her songwriting and her on tour. She doesn't quite do that. anymore. But what's really interesting to me about authenticity in Taylor is authenticity is great, but it can also be a cage, I think. And
Mm,
throughout her career, she has made moves that may challenge her fans' sense of her authenticity. Yet I think she understands that she needs to grow and she needs to
uh,
move forward. And if she's stuck too close to her quote unquote authenticity, that I think it would hurt her career longevity. So she's willing to grow and to live through that discomfort of moving beyond those authentic those authentic things that her fans love about her so much. And her move to
uh-huh.
pop was a prime example of this, right?
Right.
She ends up moving to a producer, Max Martin, who is a huge pop producer. He's one of the most famous producers in the world. And he was famous for working with Britney Spears, the Backstreet Boys. Now, these artists were the type of artists that Taylor was trying to avoid. She didn't want to come across as a manufactured pop star. She wanted to come across as a country music star who was writing her own songs. Yet she knew that she had to grow in her career. She knew she had to challenge herself. And that's what she did. So I think we all need to think of this balance between authenticity is great, right? We need to
Mhm.
live our values. We need to express ourselves in authentic ways, but we also need to grow and challenge ourselves. And it's always about striking that balance. And that's what Taylor has always done well.
You mentioned adaptation and reinvention, and I wanna dive a little deeper into that. Her pivot obviously from country to pop and then to indie. One of the things that you talk about in the book is that she is the master of the slow pivot. Which I thought was so interesting because sort of looking at it, we don't always think about our pivots that way. Maybe provide a bit more context around what you mean by that and kind of how sort of what you found as you researched the book and thought about all of these sort of adaptations and reinventions of Taylor.
Her reinventions and the fact that she tends to take them pretty slowly comes down to her fans. Taylor always surprises her fans, but she never shocks her fans. And that's something that she said, and I think that's a mantra that she has followed throughout her career. It's all about trust and consistency for her. And this is especially true early on in her career. She didn't change so much that she alienated her fans, yet she changed enough where they felt like they were getting something new. So when she made this big move to pop music, it wasn't a complete shock because she had been dabbling in pop over many albums, right? So when she left country music, didn't have any country songs in her album. This is 1989. Yes, her fans, some of her fans were surprised and maybe there was a little grief that she wasn't creating
Mhm.
country songs anymore, but it didn't come as a shock because she had been dabbling in pop for so long. And I think this is an important point too, because a lot of other artists, they try to make these huge pivots and they can be shocking and it does send shockwaves through the fan base. And that's really never been the case with Taylor. I think she understands that this relationship with her fans is a vulnerable relationship. It's a powerful relationship, and she doesn't want to alienate them in any ways.
Yeah, so fascinating. Maybe talk a little bit about her fast cycle release strategy during the pandemic and sort of how that comports with this kind of the slow pivot approach that she takes.
Taylor in 2019 released an album called Lover. And like many of us, she had reached a career stall. Now, that album did well compared to everyone else. But if you compared that album to other Taylor Swift albums, it didn't really do as well as her previous albums. So you could argue that she had reached a growth
Mm,
stall. Huge companies face this problem, but we face this in our personal lives too. And a big reason for that is Taylor was using very similar strategies than she had used before, but the world had rapidly
mhm.
changed. The music industry had rapidly changed. At this point, streaming was the main way that people were listening to music. And streaming isn't just a distribution engine, it really has changed the way that we think about music. It's changed the way we listen to music, and it's changed the way that we interact with music and our artists. And Taylor had always taken a very precious approach to album releases. Every 2 years, she'd release an album. It would come out with major fanfare, major media hype. But during the pandemic, she was forced or encouraged to change her
Mhm.
approach. There was no distribution of vinyl albums at the time, or at least she had to wait to release those vinyl albums. And so she released herself released herself with the burden of being a huge pop star. She didn't have to think about, how is this song going to sound on the
Uh-huh.
radio? How is this song going to sound in a stadium? And she released an album, surprise dropped an album, Folklore, which was an indie rock album, which she released to huge critical success. And then she continued to release albums at a fast clip. Over the last 4.5 years since that point, she has released 8 new albums, 4 new studio albums, and 4 new re-records.
It's extraordinary, an extraordinary amount of work.
That is that is releasing album at a very fast clip. But it's also because she had adapted to the streaming age at this point. The streaming age, and you can put streaming in the entire attention economy, it's really hard to catch people's attention. It really is. Our attention is fragmented. And Taylor found a way to engage her audience, right? But once she has engaged her audience, it's important to continually engage them over and over and over again. And that was the big change over the last 4 years, is instead of being precious, she turned prolific. And this was a big reason why the Eras Tour was so successful, why the demand for that Eras Tour was so
Mhm.
huge, because she had changed those strategies. And she ended up doing something that a lot of companies struggle with. That's, after a growth stall, how do you find new growth
Mhm.
again? And I saw a stat recently that only 10% of companies are really able to do that. And I'm sure that number is probably less for artists. It's really hard for artists to pivot after a stall like that. But Taylor was able to do it.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many dimensions to this that I have found fascinating, especially related to the Eras Tour and the fact that she was able to leverage. We weren't going to concerts during the pandemic, right? And a lot of people were slow to go back to concerts even after that because they didn't want to be in huge arenas with hundreds of thousands of people,
Yeah.
right? Um, but whether she understood that or whether it was that moment in time that she was able to capitalize on and was ready for it, I'm curious about
Uh-huh.
sort of your thoughts related to that. How much did she sort of see this as this moment to really leverage the fact that people were really going to want to go to concerts once they were ready to be back together?
Yeah. I don't see Taylor as a mastermind who's very calculated. I know a lot of people think that of her. And there's a quote that I used very early on in the book in the introduction, where she had received the Innovator of the Year award with iHeartRadio, and she got up on stage, she accepts the award, and she's almost sheepish about it. And she said, you know, I don't wake up every day saying I want to innovate stuff. She's like, I wake up and I do what's best for me, and that's the way I make decisions. And I make decisions that are based on the circumstances, and it just so happens that a lot of those decisions are choices that people hadn't made before. And that's how I see Taylor. She's a very music-first person. She makes decisions based on what's best for her, what's best for her music, what's best for her songs, and then the strategies come second. So I don't think she masterminded the Eras Tour to be such a huge success. I don't think she was thinking necessarily that, oh, I need to make these big changes because of streaming. I'm sure those are in the back of her mind, but I really think her decisions tend to be very based on the music. And we saw this with the Eras Tour too. Yes, the demand was high. She really took advantage of the situation because she hadn't toured in 4 years. Yet I think she understood that this was a really critical moment in her career, and she could have positioned that tour in many different ways. She she had just released an album, Midnights. It could have been the Midnights tour. But I think she was smart enough to understand, well, I'm releasing all this music. I'm releasing re-records of my old albums. And maybe I should celebrate my entire career. She was bumping up against 20 years in the industry. And I think that was a smart move on her part, because the Eras Tour turned out to be a celebration of her career, yes, but it was also a celebration of the experiences she had with fans over those 20 years. She really leaned into all those past eras, the way she dressed, the aesthetics of those eras. And I think she created a atmosphere where her and her fans could reminisce and reconnect. And I think that was the genius of the Eras Tour.
Yeah, and I think from a fan standpoint, I know you saw the Eras Tour, so did I, about 5 times. Um, so we spent a lot of time going to the Eras Tour over that 18-month period. But the shared experience with your fans of, I wasn't necessarily experiencing her youthful angst at the point in which she was writing some of those early songs, but it
Yeah.
took me back to those moments in my own life where I was thinking about this. And so the connection that she's able to make with people, both in helping to inspire or sort of remind you of those experiences yourself. And then, for her younger fans, those that have been going along with her on this journey from the beginning, remembering where they were when they first heard that song and sort of that connection point
Yep.
was so incredibly fascinating to me.
I think the context is important here too, because Taylor, throughout her career, I say follows a modified version of Newton's third law. For whatever positive reaction she receives, she tends to receive equal or greater negative reaction.
Right.
And Taylor Swift has not been a cool artist to follow for her career. She has received a lot of criticisms. Her fans have received a lot of criticism. And I think a lot of people have been skeptical of Taylor Swift because she was a teen girl writing songs for teen girls. And even though she's grown and she's 35 years old, that skepticism still remains. But what's so great about the Eras Tour, she leaned into all of those things. And she's done this her entire career. She's been criticized for things, but she doubles and triples down on what she's really good at, even though she's criticized for those things. So I think that was the underlying context, especially for her OG fans who've been around for so long, and why the Eras Tour was a emotional experience for so many people, because they had gone through that criticism and those bad moments with her, yet she has never run away from what she's good at and what she values. And that's why the Eras Tour was such a great experience for so many people.
It's so interesting, the idea of how she has dealt with, criticism and setbacks is one of the themes that I wanted to make sure that we dig into a bit today in this conversation, because it's such a powerful theme for her, and I think it's a powerful theme for anyone. Let's talk a little bit about how she's handled some of those more high-profile ones, the Kanye West situations, the problems that she had with Scooter Braun, losing her masters, all those sorts of things. Let's talk a little bit about how she handled those and how her approach is a little different than what we oftentimes see.
The most fascinating moment for me, and I talk about this in the book, is 2009. Taylor had cornered the country market, and now she's slowly infiltrating the pop market. So she's finding herself in situations where most country artists don't find themselves in. So 2009, she's at the MTV VMA Awards. Now, the VMAs are notorious for being wild affairs. And Taylor, that really wasn't her thing. So she goes, she wins an award very early on in the ceremony, and it's for Best Female Video. And she wins. And she goes up on stage, and then all of a sudden there's Kanye West. He takes her mic, and in front of millions of people, he essentially says, "You don't deserve this. Beyonce deserves this." Now, that had to be an extremely embarrassing moment for Taylor Swift. That had to be heartbreaking for her. She was a Kanye West fan. Now, back in 2009, Kanye West was like the rap artist, and he was really known for being a really innovative rapper and producer. So he was at the top of the industry, and there he is telling people that she doesn't deserve to be there. Now, around this time, too, Taylor was getting a lot of criticism. She was also receiving a lot of awards, but she was being criticized for her princess fixation, her voice. People didn't think her voice was up to snuff, and she was getting criticized in very public ways. And so what does she do? Instead of retreating, instead of trying to change who she is, she got some voice lessons, which was good. But for her third album, she doubled and tripled down on what she does well. She created a Taylor Swift album on steroids, essentially. And that album, Speak Now, is one of the most vulnerable and emotional albums of her career. And she decided to write that album all by herself. And in a very Taylor Swift way, she didn't leave people to figure that out. she made that part of her promotional campaign. So she made that moment of humiliation, of embarrassment, of criticism into a moment of empowerment for her and her fans. And that's what she does so well. She takes those moments and she either turns it into great music or she turns it into opportunities to grow closer with her and her fans.
Do you ever see that in the corporate context? As you sort of look at other companies, other musical artists, other sort of individuals, do you see evidence of of approaching criticism and setback in that same way?
It's very unusual. I think a big reason why it's unusual too is because Taylor, we can take so much from her career and apply it to a corporate context, but some of it we really can't because she is the product, right? She's the product. She's the one selling the product. She's the brand. So she's able to do things that maybe a corporation couldn't do. They couldn't necessarily take that risk. And one of the big ways that she's done this is during a second Kanye controversy back in 2017, I believe, 2016. Taylor thought her career was over because it seemed like people were turning against her. And what does she do? She releases an album called Reputation, where she makes that sense that my reputation is tarred. She makes that the subject of the album. And she does something called narrative reversal, where she took all of the criticism that was being thrown at her and she embraced it and she embraced that iconography. People were calling her a snake. So she used the snake iconography in the album positioning in her concerts and she wrote songs about it. She wrote songs about that character that people were saying that she was a snake, that she was a liar, that she was a manipulator. And that's also really unique. I know there have been some companies that have done things like that, but it takes a risk to do that. And Taylor has always been willing to take a risk. And I think that's another reason why she's so successful because she knows that she can't stay in the same place for so long. And when she goes through a controversy or she goes through a growth stall, she knows that she needs to make a substantial pivot.
Yeah. As you were doing the research on this book, I believe you did not have an opportunity to talk directly to her, but did you talk to some of the people around her, and how did you kind of form some of the bases of the particular takeaways that you included in the book? Who were you talking to ultimately form your opinions and thoughts?
Yeah. So I did not talk to Taylor directly. We did reach out. Of course, it would be malpractice not to reach out to her. But she was very busy at the time. She was traveling the globe for the Eras tour. Taylor actually made me feel lazy because I wrote this book at a pretty fast clip. I wrote it it took me about a year to research, but it took me about a year to write, which is really fast for me. And at the same time, Taylor was releasing multiple albums. She had toured the entire globe while I was doing that. So and I was working hard too, but she works much harder than I do, I guess. And yeah, so the one thing I didn't want to do is since I couldn't talk to her directly, and her team is more secretive than the CIA. So if you can't get in touch with Taylor, then you're really not going to get any inside information because her team is very small. She runs her team like a family business. Her parents are actively involved. Her brother's actively involved. But I didn't want to write a book where if I couldn't talk to her, that I was talking to people who are like 4 to 5 points removed from her. Because I've read books like that and I always feel their absence. And I don't think that would do her I don't think it would have done the book a I don't think it would have done the book a solid, and I don't think it would have done Taylor Swift a solid to do that. Now, the great thing about Taylor, though, is she has been very articulate about the decisions that she's made throughout her career. She doesn't hold back. She's done lots of interviews, especially very early in her career. She was talking to everyone. And I had so many great sources to rely on and get her opinion about why she made the decisions that she was making. So that's really what I relied on. And for me, I always tell my authors, because I'm a book editor, how is this a book that only you could write? And what I was really bringing to the table was the research, taking business research, art research, research and creativity innovation, and applying it to Swift's career. So that's really what I relied upon in order to make this a book that's different than others.
You mentioned how tight her team is. Obviously, she has collaborators, other folks that she writes with, that she produces with. Let's talk a little bit about how she approaches collaboration as well.
Taylor is loyal with an asterisk. That's how I describe it when it comes to her collaborators. She's not a superstar who shops for producers or shops for hits. This is very common in the music industry. She tends to stick to very close collaborators and forms long-term relationships with them. So for her first 3 albums, she worked with the same producer. His name's Nathan Chapman. He's based out of Nashville. And the great thing about Nathan is he hadn't produced an album before when he produced her debut, but Taylor loved the sounds of her demos because he created her demos, and she insisted that she work with him, and she stuck with him over 3 albums. So that's why those first 3 albums are very consistent in sound. And then she has moved on to other co-producers. Now she works mostly exclusively with Jack Antonoff and another producer named Aaron Dessner, who is in the band The National. And she's worked with them over the course of 3 to 4 albums. So she's really good at developing these long-term relationships. She's really good at developing that trust and consistency. But when she has to make a change, she'll do it and she'll make a pivot. And she's done this at multiple points in her career when she really needs someone to help her develop a new sound or to expand her sound or to really give voice and sound to the new ideas that are going through her head. She will make a pivot. And that also speaks to her longevity, right? Because it's all about relationships for her. And she will stick with a producer or co-producer for a long period of time. And yet, still, if she has to make those tough moves, that's what she'll do.
Yeah, it's so interesting because you see that, the connection that she has with the people that she's working with, her collaborators, but you also see that really tight connection and that trust that she develops with fans. And so that consistency, I think, across all of the people that are part of her much broader orbit, I think that's a really interesting takeaway. So, Kevin, as you reflect on this book and the time that you spent thinking about and researching Taylor Swift, what was the biggest surprise that you had in looking at her career? Was there anything that really jumped out at you that you think would be particularly relevant to other folks that they could sort of put to use in their own life?
Before I started researching this book, I understood that Swift was business savvy. She's always been known as being a business savvy artist. But I thought she was business savvy because she had followed a superstar playbook relentlessly, that she was a ruthless tactician. And the opposite is true in my mind. And this is what surprised me. She doesn't follow a typical playbook. And if you look at different junctures in her career, these big moments in her career where she's grown her popularity, those came from big, bold choices that she made. And this is the way I think of Taylor Swift. A lot of people see the sequins, they see the glitter, they see the Louboutin boots, and those things are all great. But I see someone who makes punk rock decisions at times. I see someone who makes bold decisions, especially at times when you wouldn't think she would need to make those bold decisions. When she moved to pop, she was coming off of 3 straight #1 albums. You would think that the playbook would be keep doing what you're doing, keep doing what you're doing. But she didn't do that. Her re-record project was another risky move, right? She made such a big deal about emotionally how the sale of her masters had a huge impact on her. But she was essentially re-recording those albums, their close facsimiles to the originals, and telling her fans not to listen to the older music. Well, that's a crazy idea, and there's a reason why other big artists have threatened to do something like that, like Prince, but haven't followed through. Yet she's done it, and she's done this over and over and over again, and that's a big reason for her surges in growth throughout her career, is because she does take big chances. And she takes those big chances when she's at the top, when she's very successful and very popular. And that's what I'm taking away from Taylor Swift. I joke with my wife that I need to make What Would Taylor Do bracelets. And Taylor makes those big, risky decisions. And I think that's the way we should be viewing her, because it's remarkable that she is so successful and she is so popular, yet she continues to not be comfortable, to not follow the status quo. And she's all about growth and she's all about change. And that's something we can all learn from.
Yeah, absolutely. Kevin Evers, thank you so much for the time today. This has been delightful. I loved reading the book, and I love spending some time with you today. So thanks for being part of She Said, She Said.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, friend, that wraps up today's deep dive with Kevin Evers on the strategic genius of Taylor Swift. As I reflect on this conversation, there are two areas that really jumped out at me. The first is the importance of owning our own narrative. When we sharpen our story with vivid, honest detail, just like Taylor's diary-level lyrics, we're inviting people to actually see themselves in our vision and potentially to rally behind it, which I think is such an important and interesting insight. And then the second thing is learning to flip setbacks and use them as leverage. And, as Kevin and I talked about, Taylor losing her master's to ultimately topping the charts again shows that when something goes wrong, our response can become our strongest strategic assets. So friend, what about you? Which of the insights in today's conversation really hit home with you, and how will you be putting them to play this week? I would love to hear. Be sure to reach out to me on LinkedIn or Instagram. You can find me at Laura Cox Kaplan and share your thoughts. Friend, if this episode sparked an idea or maybe some inspiration for you, please follow She Said, She Said podcast, and be sure to leave a quick 5-star review and also share it with a friend who might need a dose of some Taylor-level strategy. And remember, influence isn't necessarily about the spotlight. It's about the impact and the legacy that ultimately we can have. So go make it count, and I'll see you next time. And remember, She Said, She Said podcast is a weekly production of She Said, She Said Media. Take care.